Series for the next 6 or 7 weeks on faith for living, a part of the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, concerning which there is very little known as to its authorship. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good report. Through faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous. This morning, about faith in the living of life. I want, if it is possible to do so, I want to lay the groundwork for our thinking in the subsequent days. It is obvious to say to you that everybody lives by faith. It is so obvious that its meaning is rather obscure. We have faith in today and faith in tomorrow, a lot of little faiths based upon many little facts, faith that this roof will stay where it belongs, faith that our cars will hold up when we drive them along. That faith has to be revised constantly, but there it is. We have it nevertheless. Now, it is one of the common errors, in my judgment at any rate, of religious faith, and that is the kind of faith in which I have basic interest. It is one of the common errors of religious faith to turn with a kind of abiding enthusiasm to the fact that religion is not unique in its faith, that the scientist has faith, and therefore whether the scientist knows it or not, he has the same sort of thing that religious man has. Now, I'd like to talk just 2 or 3 minutes on that observation and on what seems to me to be the basic fallacy, with which you may not be in agreement at all. But the scientist, it is true, about the scientists I group all of the people who are dealing with the phenomena of nature and any of its aspects. The scientist does affirm and does assume the uniformity of the world of nature. He assumes that the world of nature exists. He doesn't know it. He can't prove it. He assumes also that he can understand the world of nature, which he doesn't quite know, but he assumes it. And he also assumes that he can interpret the findings that he observes, and on the basis of them, he can check the validity of his assumptions. He operates on what he calls scientific hypotheses. It's a working plan, and he has certain tests for an hypothesis. He says that an hypothesis is sound scientifically, for instance, if it is simple. If it's too complicated, then there's something wrong with it. In the second place, he assumes that the hypothesis has to cover all the facts. If there are any facts that his hypothesis cannot include, then the hypothesis isn't any good. So he scraps it all the time. He's trying to find some generalization that will cover all the facts. And then he assumes also that with reference to the validity of his hypothesis, that it will be productive, that on the basis of his hypothesis, if the hypothesis be sound, then he can predict accurately events that fall within the context in which he's working. That has been demonstrated dramatically over and over again, and I need not take your time to weary you with it. But always he's working on the basis of an assumption, a working hypothesis. Now, the religious faith differs from that in some respects. For the religious faith, with reference to that which stands at the center of its operation, is not an assumption, even though you, at this point, you see, you may disagree with me. I know some people who are listening are disagreeing with me very rapidly, but I shall see you later. The religious assumption is that there isn't an assumption that God, which is the center of the religious man's faith, that God is categorical fact, not assumption. And it's interesting. You will note in the meditation for this week, you need not look at it. I'll look at it for you. What if the sky falls, the earth quakes, the mountain turns upside down, the swelling sea dries up, and the sun comes down? What if all of this to one who has attained the perfect Lord? Or, in the prophet Habakkuk, though the cattle do not be in the stall, though there's no fruit on the vine, though all of the external world withers and dies, and there seems to be no point of reference by which I can validate the significance of my inner affirmation. My affirmation remains. And that's the difference. I'll leave that, and we'll come back to it sometime before this series is over. Now, there are several things that have contributed to the breakdown of faith. Several things. One of them is that the context in which modern man is working, has been working and thinking and living, has begun to corrode and disintegrate. There seems to be nothing left upon which we may be dependent with any measure of security, tranquility. And of course, a person cannot be tranquil unless he has something about which to be tranquil. The economic order is shifting, political order is in some sort of scramble. What is there in our context upon which we may depend? At various points, the primary unit, like the family, seems to be falling apart. Even the mind, the tough thing that the mind of man is, that which has won its right against all kinds of tremendous difficulties and odds, to won its right to be integrated increasingly. A tough thing like the mind, it seems to be cracking up. And those of you who read the morning's paper about an article about the mental health situation in the state of California will remember that this psychologist from up at Napa says what we have heard many times before, that 1 out of every 2 hospital beds in the United States is occupied by people whose minds are cracking. So we clutch for that. What is next to us that will give us some measure of stability, something that can give to our faith a chance to breathe, and we can keep going, for we have to have faith. Now that's one of the reasons. You see, the human spirit, I don't know how I can clarify this, but the human spirit has to center itself upon something which it regards as ultimate. For whether you recognize it or not, my friends, every one of us lives his life day by day on the basis of what to him or to her is the ultimate meaning of existence. The ultimate meaning of existence. If this is the kind of world in which purposes are meaningless, if this is the kind of world in which finally there can be found nothing upon which the human spirit can rest, then the automatic result from that great and underlying despair is a frenzy of disintegration. Now, there is a second thing that has made the necessity for faith so important in our time, and that's something that perhaps you hadn't reflected upon, and that is the positive, and please understand what I want to say now, because if it's quoted out of context, it'll be very bad. The positive effect of the great negation that has moved over the world, growing out of the rise and development of fascism during the last 10, 12, 15 years. Now let me break that down a little. You remember during the First World War, many of you are old enough to remember that. The First World War, there was a man whose name was Woodrow Wilson. Do you remember? And Woodrow Wilson gave to the war effort an interesting slogan, and that slogan was, make the world safe for democracy. And that was a very good slogan. And around that slogan, the hopes and fears and ambitions and dreams and efforts of millions of human beings were organized. It was a vague slogan, a general thing. And Mr. Wilson undertook to define it in terms of a concrete series of proposals that resulted in the League of Nations. But the League of Nations did not prove to be a rallying point for this great thing because the concept itself was not structured, and it wasn't structured because it did not have to deal with a corresponding concrete goal on the other side, on the side of the central powers, as they were called. Central powers' goals were vague. Say the word for democracy was vague, so two vague things sort of got along together. But when the Second World War came, something tremendous had happened in the world. Here was, it was an idea that was rooted fundamentally, not in a political theory as such, not in some new theory about human nature as such, but a fundamental concept that was metaphysical in its significance. For one of the interestingly unique and terrifying things about fascism is the fact that fascism has at its center just face that thing. They had to dig deep, you see, to try to find, if there be such a thing, a deeply moving metaphysical purpose that would be capable of bringing about the effects in democracies comparable to the intense loyalty and devotion that sprang up in the fascist countries. So this gap created a great sense of despair in the democracies. And you know how we worked it out in an interesting way. This is an aside, really. I shouldn't take the time, but I will. You know how it was worked out? You remember the first Atlantic Treaty? The Atlantic Treaty, Atlantic Pact, Atlantic something. Charter, thank you. When Mr. Churchill and Mr. Roosevelt met out in Iceland or somewhere in the ocean, and they drew this thing up, and it was nicely vague. It was pretty concrete, but sort of vague, you know. You could say that it meant this or that. You could say that it did influence all aspects of the common life, that it did invade the democratic process and give it structure and meaning and validity, or you could say it's one of these general things. And you remember the rumbling that came from India when that was announced. And Mr. Churchill had to face the fact, does this apply to India? A general pattern of commitment. It's a general thing, an umbrella under which all the peoples will finally get their place, but don't get any ideas. Any ideas. And as soon as that hit the international wires, Mr. Roosevelt had to say that the Atlantic Charter applied without discrimination, but with utter ruthlessness to the whole gamut of the common life and the democracies. In other words, this was the statement of the centrality of purpose that was seeking for a metaphysical basis capable of providing an influence, a power, a vitality, a dynamic for restructuring all of the aspects of the democratic life in the light of this central purpose. So the issues were drawn. And all the little people like us began trying to spell out the meaning of democracy, not in terms that were vague, but in terms that were concrete, that would have bearing on this ultimate struggle, you see, as defined. And then we discovered we didn't know very much about democracy. We discovered that we did not believe too much in democracy. And a general sense of skepticism and a kind of despair crept over us. And that is obtained even to the latest time. So now, as we face another kind of metaphysical purpose as expressed in the orthodox position of communism, we are involved in every kind of scramble, trying to make all sorts of people sign all sorts of things in order that by the word, if we can get the word signed, then the word signed becomes a metaphysical purpose capable of generating a pattern of behavior that will make our country and other countries decent places in which to live. It is the anguish of the spirit of man as it faces the insistence of a terrifying metaphysical purpose that seems to be organizing one section of the human race around dreams and hopes and ideals that we may not be able to match. Now, that's why it's important that you and I begin working out for ourselves the basis of some sort of faith for living in these times. Now, there's a third reason, and that is the great advance that has been made in modern science. The vastness of this world is just something. There was a time, when the earth was the center of everything, and you knew that everything revolved around the earth, and that was good. And the biggest thing on the earth was man. And that meant that everything finally revolved around man. So that the first person who took exception to that and began talking about space that extended beyond the canopy of the heavens, organized religion, organized and orthodox science, began persecuting him and trying to make him take his words back. We are caught in the vastness of the universe, and our little planet is but a tiny speck of stardust whirling mathematically through space. And we live in the western half of that tiny speck of stardust, in the northern part of the western half of that tiny speck of stardust, in one little state, in one country, in the northern part of the western half of that tiny speck of stardust, in one town, many of us in one room, in one town, in one county, in one state, in the northern part of the western half of that tiny speck of stardust, so that when you get to the spot that we actually occupy in the vastness of the universe, we are vanishing quantity. And out of our sense of despair, which is a despair that is different from the other kind about which I was talking. It is a despair that is a derivative from a sense of isolation, a sense of aloneness in the vastness of the universe. And in our aloneness, in our isolation, we say, we cry aloud, and there is no voice to hear. If I could find something that I can do, something that will give to my life some meaning, something that will give me a sense of being related somehow. I want that. I must have it. It's the only way that I can break this sense of isolation, the backwash of which is a kind of creeping loneliness that seems to be pervading our whole land as you talk with people. So what is really at stake is this. The ultimate basis of our self-respect is at stake. For unless I can find some ultimate basis for my self-respect, then I have nothing that can stand up against all this vastness. So I try a lot of things. I try to find a job. Much of the emphasis in the vocational emphasis in our schools and even down to the grade level now is an indirect result, an effort on the part of the mind and the skills of modern man to deal with this problem of isolation of the individual. So if I can find a job, a task, some vocation that will test my life, then when I pass that test, I can use the results of that examination to fling my defiance into the impersonal, the cold deeps of space by which my little planet is surrounded. And then when I look at the job I do, I realize that even though I think I do it all myself, that I really don't do it all myself. Because my job, however successful the job may be, my job is dependent upon you and a lot of other people that I don't know. They figure into it, so I can't get all the credit, so it's not a good test. And then as I look at myself, I say, but after all, at this point, that point, and the other point, I got what I call a break. And that's why I was able to do what I did. So there's always the element of luck, the element that is accidental, as if it were a conspiracy on the part of life to take from me my reason for having a fundamental basis for self-respect. Because if what I do in my vocation is dependent upon you and due to a lot of accidental factors, then I can't get all the credit for it. And I must have credit. And then I try to identify myself as something else that's more permanent. I say, well, there's one thing, if I can get money in the world, if I can get some sort of monument like that, if I can identify myself with something that will last long after I'm gone, then that'll be it. Even though I lost, but my echo is frozen in some monument somewhere. And then I realized that even the economic power that I'm able to generate or collect or realize upon is also dependent upon a whole series of forces: stability of the economic order, laws, the thousands of people to labor, the general agreement under which men decide to do business. All these factors, forces over which I have no particular control as an individual, but with reference to which I am obligated, and therefore I can't take credit for it myself. And then finally I'm driven to this position, that if there be any order in life, if there be any ultimate meaning in individual history and in human history, it must be related to a power, a vitality, a mind in which I may participate, but the existence of which is not dependent upon my conception. And in my moment of greatest quietness, one by one, I strip myself of all the phony devices by which I undertake to give myself a validation and a self-respect. And in that moment, I face what in the language of religion is the scrutiny of God, with nothing between me and his eyes. And when God looks into my spirit, what can I say for myself?